This data set actually has the most numbers we've had on diversity so far about the tech industry. It has numbers for companies that have more than 100 employees and who've never released their reports.
I'm Jen Taylor-Skinner, and this is the Electorette. Today's guest is Sinduja Rangarajan. She's a reporter from Reveal News, the Center for Investigative Reporting. Sinduja recently published a report detailing Silicon Valley's diversity numbers. We've seen these reports on diversity numbers in Silicon Valley before, and it's no secret that there are some disparities there, especially among underrepresented minorities. But this isn't just any report. The report's findings are the first of its kind, actually, and it features an analysis of nearly 200 of the largest tech firms in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this analysis uncovers deeply troubling trends in racial and gender disparities across these companies, especially among Black and Latino workers. What this report reveals about Silicon Valley is so fascinating, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Sinduja Rangarajan. Sinduja Rangarajan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So the report that you released is described as the clearest picture of Silicon Valley's diversity yet. And, until I read your report, I thought I had a pretty good understanding of what diversity was like in Silicon Valley. I think everyone understands that there isn't much diversity there. But I'm curious about your report in comparison to previous reports that have come out. I think there was one that came out in March, which gave diversity numbers for Uber, for instance, and some other Silicon Valley tech companies. So how is this report different?
This is a really interesting question and gets to the heart of how our analysis is a little bit different from the reports that have come out so far. For all that coverage and report about diversity, surprisingly, there's not that much data about diversity out there. Some of the major companies, like you mentioned, Uber and Facebook, Google, Intel, they release their numbers publicly. They release something called as they release diversity reports, and they also release something called as EEO1 forms. These are one-page forms that companies are supposed to submit to the federal government every year, giving a breakdown of their workforce, their race, their gender, demographics. And what tends to happen is that these companies release them to the public. Most of Silicon Valley doesn't. And so most of the analysis that's been centered around has been looking at numbers from these companies. What we did was we filed FOIA requests. We asked around 211 companies in Silicon Valley to release this data, and most of them didn't. So far, I think 30 odd companies, which is less than a third, have released this data for any year. And then we said, how do we know what's happening with the industry? Not just the top companies and assume that they're representative of the industry, but what is happening with the rest of Silicon Valley? And so we went to an academic who has access to this data, who has access to this EEO1 reports that companies send to the federal government because he works with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissions. He has a special contract with them, and he was able to give us these numbers for 177 companies, some of the largest companies in Silicon Valley, and he anonymized the numbers. So we don't know the names of the companies and we can't attach that to the numbers. But we got a very good sense of the distribution of these numbers and the industry in general.
Right. So these EEO reports, so they're required to submit them if they have a certain number of employees, but they are not required to report the data to the public. Is that correct?
Yes. They have to submit it to the federal government if they have more than 100 employees. If they're a federal contractor, then if they have more than 50 employees, but they're not required to submit them to the public. And most companies don't. And there's also a little bit of controversy around forms. Companies often say that, these forms they're not reflective of how they think about their workforce because the forms tend to have job categories which the companies don't even have. So the companies criticize the reports, but most of them, some of the big companies, I shouldn't say most actually, that's not right, but some of the big companies like Google or Facebook, they release their own diversity reports. And then on top of that, they also release the EEO1. And that's how it's been for the big companies.
Right. I also find it really fascinating because you had a separate report or published a separate report about how you obtain the data. And I think that that's fascinating in itself because it's kind of cloak and dagger. So when you approach these companies, some of them refuse to give you this data, correct?
Some of them, actually most of them refuse to give this data.
Yeah.
Like we asked, 211 companies, and then we got back responses. Some of them were already releasing it publicly, like Google. So wasn't very hard to get those. We just had to grab it from the website. And then some of them gave it to us. That happened last fall. Pinterest was an example. I think Square was an example. They gave it to us. And then that's about it. And then that was around 23 companies last year. And then ever since we published the first report, we heard back from PayPal, we heard back from Slack, and we've heard back from a few other companies. So far, I think it's around the count is around 30. So the majority of them wouldn't give out these reports publicly. So we had to go through the route of collaborating with an academic at the Center for Employment Equity at the University of Massachusetts Amherst to get this data.
Right. I mean, that's not really surprising because the culture of a lot of these companies is around having a lack of transparency, right? When you think about the news that's come out about Facebook and how they handled, election data with ads being sold and the fake news debacle, they're known for having a lack of transparency. So this isn't a surprise to me, at least, I guess. So some of the companies actually used the excuse that diversity numbers were a trade secret. How do you justify that? How do they define that as a trade secret?
I think we're also struggling to know that. And that's why we filed a lawsuit with the Department of Labor, because the Department of Labor has access to their EEO1 reports. And, we can file, and if they're a federal contractor, we can file a Freedom of Information Act request, and we could ask the Department of Labor to give up those reports. So what typically happens is the Department of Labor asks the company for their permission, and some companies, deny. Some companies allow, actually, and then they're like, fine, you can release the EEO1 report from our end. And then Sanmina, the electronics manufacturer, Sanmina is an example of that. We got their reports through FOIA requests. But then there are several others who just deny, for example, Pandora, Oracle, Palantir Technologies, federal contractors. These are all federal contractors. Palantir and some of these companies even have been accused of discrimination and are involved in discrimination lawsuits. But then they would still deny or tell the Department of Labor that this information shouldn't be released to the public. And specifically, I think some of them say that this is a trade secret. I think an example of that is Gilead Sciences. They would justify it being a trade secret. I think Pandora is another example because we're still struggling to know what the reasons are for why they would classify it as a trade secret. One of the things we've heard from our reporting is when you have the EEO1 form that we request is like this consolidated report that talks about all their employees in the US. I think that they don't want to give out a breakdown of employees by offices because they're afraid of poaching. But really, we don't understand why it's a trade secret because some of their biggest competitors, some of the larger tech companies, including like I mentioned, Facebook and Cisco and Adobe, they all release these numbers every year publicly, and they release this consolidated EEO1 report. So we don't understand why it's a trade secret for others, and we're still trying to figure that out.
Right. Maybe we should explain, because I'm not sure if everyone understands what an EEO report is, right? I mean, does that stand for Equal Employment Opportunity Report? Is that?
Yes. It's basically just a form that the companies are required to submit to the federal government. What they're required to submit to the federal government has a lot of components to it, but basically it's a form where they give out the breakdown of their employees by race and gender. So they have certain fixed racial categories. There's a debate about how those forms can be better, but you would give out your employees, you would basically give out those forms, and you would fill out those forms as a company and then submit it to the federal government and give an employee count by race, gender, and job category. So it's not just how many Black employees do I have, but how many Black men, how many Black women, and where are they? Where are they in the company? Are they executives? Are they in managerial positions? Are they professionals, which would include marketing professionals, analysts, tech professionals, non-tech professionals? Are they doing admin support jobs? And so it would just give a breakdown by categories, and it's the same form for every company, and companies are different, and an Airbnb is different from an Uber, is different from a Google. So companies in different ways are different, but they all have to classify their employees according to the categories on the spreadsheet and then submit that form or those set of forms to the federal government every year.
Right. So let's dig into some of the data. So first of all, how did you choose the companies to look at?
We looked at the largest companies in Silicon Valley. We said, that's what we were interested in, and we were interested in the largest companies. So obviously, we were interested in the companies that everybody knows about. But then we were also interested in the companies that were defining our lives, but were kind of under the radar. One of the examples is probably Nvidia or Oracle, or they're really big companies that define Silicon Valley, but not everybody knows about them like you would think about a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter. So we wanted to look at all these companies, and so we consulted some lists. So we went to the San Jose Mercury News. They put out a list called SV 150, which is the top 150 companies, publicly traded companies, and they rank them. And we took that list and then we said, but this is all publicly traded companies. What about, startups like Uber or Airbnb or Pinterest? We wanted them in the list as well because they're startups, they're extremely successful, but they're not public yet. And so we looked at a list of unicorns, which is basically any company which is valued at more than $1 billion. And we looked at Crunchbase and we looked at CB Insights, and we consulted with these lists, and we just picked all the startups which were a part of that unicorn list, which were based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. So that means we've excluded companies like Amazon or Microsoft because we just wanted to focus in on Silicon Valley.
Right. So which companies, what are the top three that fared the worst?
I wouldn't say, that's a good question, but it's also a complicated question because companies that do well on one criteria also have work to do because they lag behind on others. And so when you think about companies that lag behind on one criteria, they're also doing fairly okay on something else. One of the examples is that we write about is Nvidia. It's in the bottom 5 for the representation of women workers, and in the bottom 4, actually tied with another company, so I say bottom 5, but they're really in the bottom 4 for women workers in their workforce out of 177 companies. So that's like 4 out of 177. There are 3 companies that have a lower representation of women than Nvidia. One of them was dynamic glass, smart glass manufacturer View. But, if you look at View's numbers for Black people in general, they also have one of the highest share of Black workers in Silicon Valley. With Nvidia, they have a very low quotient for women, and they also rank low for underrepresented minorities, Black, Latino, multiracial workers, but they have a high share of Asian professionals. So it's companies doing terrible on one thing, doing fairly okay on something else. But overall, I think that's the key message, that even if, for example, 23andMe, one of the most diverse places for women, has one of the highest numbers for women leaders and executives, also has 100% of its executive rung is white and Asian. So it doesn't have any underrepresented minorities in its executive rung and leadership team. So every company that we looked at, most of the companies have work to do.
Right. And you said that also the numbers could be misleading because the diversity picture overall is so bad. A company could have, just a couple of Black executives, for example, or just a couple of women executives, and that would put them at the higher end of the ranking, just because overall there's just so few.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key point. And the interesting thing about this is, we looked at percentages. Our anonymized data set of 177 companies has percentages. And when we looked at the EEO1 forms, though, it had raw numbers, and then we had to calculate the percentages out of that. The interesting thing is, the more transparency or the more data we have, the more nuanced our analysis can get. An example of this is Black executives at NetApp and at Lyft and at some of these companies, which have few Black executives, still high on the ranking because others are doing even worse. And Adobe is an example of a company that had 93 executives in 2016, and none of them were Black. So, even though NetApp had only 3 Black executives, it's still 3 out of 36 and 8%. And so they deserve credit for that. But looking at the whole picture, even having a few Black executives would catapult companies to the top of the rankings for that reason.
Yeah. I think Facebook's numbers, they have 10 Black executives, at least at the time that you did the report. So that number sounds good, a nice round number, but percentage wise, an impact for the overall company is probably small. They probably have a small imprint.
I think they had more than 10 So I think it was around 14, and it was 14 out of, I believe, 496. I don't have my numbers with me right now, so I think this is going to be the ballpark, and it's above average when it comes to the executive rung and for Black executives. And the only company that I can say for sure in that 2016 report which had more than 10 Black executives.
So, what does the overall picture look like? What does the data look like starting at the executive level?
The finding is with the share, not so much with the numbers. So it's a percentage that's dropping, and I think it would actually translate to fewer people of color higher up the rung. So the disparities are particularly stark at the executive level, and when you look at numbers for Asian women, or when they're professionals, they're around 8-12%. And then when you move up to managers, it's 8. And then when you move up to executives, it's 4%. The key thing to remember about this is we're looking at percentages. And then when we look at percentages for white men or even white women, for white men, the number is growing. And then for white women, it's sort of constant. I think it's 13 for professionals, 18 for managers. So it goes up a little, and then it's 14 for executives. It's not dropping down like it did for Asian women. And similarly, same things for Black and Latino workers as well. First of all, the numbers are very poor in general. So the drop off, when you look at them in the charts, that you don't see those trends as clearly because you're starting out with 1 or 2% or 3 or 4% of Black or Latino workers, even at the professional level. And then even at the managerial level, they might be constant or there might be a drop. And then there's definitely a drop at the executive level. So that's true for most of the groups except for white employees.
Right. So, do you have any data about how certain anomalies happen? Right. You mentioned there was one company that had a large number of Black employees or Black professionals, and also 23andMe had a large number of women. How do those anomalies happen?
I'm not sure that they're anomalies in the sense that, the interesting thing about this data is that we show, or the data at least shows, that diversity is possible. I mean, that there's variations. So you have companies on one end of the spectrum, but you also have companies in the middle and the other end of the spectrum, most of whom we don't know who they are. And that's what links to this transparency issue, that we
Right.
want to know who they are. Who are the companies which don't have any Black employees in 2016 or any female executives in 2016? But who are the companies that have 82% of their managers and executives are women? But which is that company either? We don't know who's on either end of the spectrum, and we don't know most of who's in the middle either. So it's not an anomaly in the sense that there are companies that have better numbers than their peers. Not that they don't have work to do, but they have better numbers than their peers. And the interesting thing is, so I spoke to the companies which did have these better numbers. One of them was NetApp, the other one was 23andMe. And one of the things that I learned from 23andMe was the employees really think about their CEO, who's a female founder and a female CEO, and really believe that her presence and the tone that she set has really helped them be more diverse. That's something I kept hearing again and again in my reporting, and heard the same thing for Pinterest as well, that the CEO sort of sets the tone for what diversity should look like, and therefore has been able to invest in resources and invest in the importance of what the value means to the company and how it shapes the company. And so they're able to do and try different things and hire more diverse staff for that reason. So that's something I heard from companies over and over again.
Right. That's actually a really important key piece of information that's missing, right? I mean, you can't take the example of 23andMe and apply it elsewhere if the data isn't available, right? You can only make an anecdotal guess as to, what makes some companies better at this than others.
Yeah, and we've done some reporting on that, but yeah, there's still a lot of work to do. And the other thing I heard was, companies that really care about diversity consult experts and are willing to learn from people who know this, who do evidence-based work, and are willing to consult with them and willing to accept or look into their shortcomings and sort of keep improving upon that.
I mean, I guess one assumption you can make in this case is that, the CEO at 23andMe is a woman. And I think that there is some indicators, at least, maybe anecdotally, that, women will hire more women, or there are less gender disparities across the company when the executive levels have more women.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we heard from our reporting over and over again. The other part of this is also, when a lot of hiring, and people keep saying this all the time, the people hire from their networks. And so when you belong to a majority group, you tend to look at the schools you went to, and you tend to look at your friends and your network, and you would hire people like you. So that's what happens. And so that's the flip side of the coin, why Silicon Valley has come to a place where it's not very diverse, because there's no conscious attention paid to the issue for a while. It's changing now, but that's the history of that, so that people hire from networks and therefore end up hiring people looking like them.
Right. And it goes beyond that. It goes to promotions and, new job opportunities within the company, right? Because a lot of this is about culture in the company, the culture in the company, and socializing within the company and having networks within the company. So even if someone, a Black person or a woman gets their foot into the door in one of these companies, they may not be able to build the social networks or the connections to climb, right? Which kind of leads
Yes.
to attrition levels.
Absolutely. And then there's very little data on attrition. The one company that's released attrition data for the very first time is Google this year, a few weeks ago. Apart from that, we have very little data on attrition. And this is almost like the first step, knowing the EEO ones are flawed. They don't have everything, but they still have a lot of information. They're standardized. And even to get that consolidated, aggregated report of how your workforce looks like has been an uphill battle. And so retention is also very key data, and that's missing also. Even from our reporting over and over again, we convened a roundtable in January with women of color working in tech. And one of the things we kept hearing was that, they need sponsorship. That's different from just, getting tips on how to do well or be mentored, but someone who can really advocate for you and your work and make you visible in the company. And a lot of women of color don't have opportunities to get promoted, to switch teams, to really grow. And many times companies miss out on the value they can bring.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on and I wanted to dig into this report is because, we were talking offline about my own experience. I spent my entire career in technology, and I don't live in Silicon Valley. I live in Seattle, but the experience is pretty much the same. And I was thinking back on my own career, and the two big breaks I had in my career were when I had women as managers, right? One was a Black woman and one, was a white woman, but those are the only big breaks I had in my career. And one of the teams that I had was, the team was 80% women. The manager was actually a woman, right? And I kind of saw those patterns over and over throughout my career.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
I mean, that's very interesting. It's not to say that, men managers don't promote women, or that they don't do a good job of doing that. I think we really don't have evidence to say that, but it's just the awareness of being in a position of power, and noticing people who are doing well and having an opportunity to advocate or sponsor for them. One of the people I spoke to said it's about what gets said behind closed doors. How is your mentor or your sponsor really advocating for you behind closed doors for you, and how are they making you visible so you get the next big project, or you get to work on something that's beneficial for your career. And that's a key piece that's missing, especially for women of color in tech.
Yeah, and there was a report recently, I can't remember where I saw this, but on mentorships, right, in these companies. And, when there is not a connection culturally between an employee and a manager, those mentorships, the employees lose out on those mentorships, right? They can't advocate for someone that they don't have a connection with, or they won't advocate for someone that they don't have a connection with. And so I think women and people of color miss out in that way as well.
Yes, I mean, there's lots of reporting about isolation and feeling isolated, and really not seeing people like you in leadership, represented in leadership, not having access to to people who would understand where you're coming from and help you on board into the company, into the company's culture, and really let you grow. And I think that's a key part of retention. That's a key part of letting employees grow and creating those pathways for people to grow, because they don't have those connections and they don't have people who are teaching them the language that they're supposed to use in these platforms.
All right, so let's talk about some specific examples. Shania King Roberson, she was at Google, right? And so what happened with her career?
So Shania King Robertson, a trailblazer employee, she was at Google. She joined as a contractor and she was writing on community blogs and got a full-time position, moved up to be a project manager, and was doing many things that a product manager would do, according to her, planning product strategy, planning release, doing some very important work across multiple teams as a full-time employee. And then she always wanted to be a product manager, and she'd started working towards that. She'd heard from many people that having a computer science degree would help, so she even started pursuing a computer science degree. And then when a product manager position opened up, she sort of hit a ceiling. She did interviews with a team inside Google, and was told she was really good and that she should get the job. But then a manager pulled her aside, well-meaning manager, said, it's great that you want to do this, we love you, but I don't think you can pass like company-wide tests because you don't have a degree, you don't have the software engineering experience, so I don't think you're going to be able to make it. And so things got complicated there. If they essentially told her that she wouldn't be able to pass those company-wide tests. So there's a team interview and then there's like a company-wide interview to be a product manager. And according to her, it would take a lot of time, it was pretty bureaucratic, and so she wasn't able to make that leap. And so eventually she had to move to eBay. She did find a job as a product manager. She was still finishing up her computer science degree, and so she hadn't finished her degree. And she found out that not all companies in Silicon Valley sort of need that degree or those years of core engineering experience to be a product manager. And she's told me that it took her a long time to even believe that was true, but it was. And then she moved to eBay, and then she eventually, actually now as an update, which is not a part of the story, is that she's the head of product at a new startup now. So the point is that she was able to be a product manager and she could deliver on being a product manager. It's just that she didn't have the opportunity to do it at Google because of bureaucratic processes.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
I see. And you also said in the report that there were more Blacks and Latinos in support or customer service positions and more women in admin and support type positions. What did you find there?
I can't speak to why it is. I can just definitely speak to the fact that it is. In many of these companies, there's overrepresentation of women in support roles. So when you look at the men in support roles and then the women in support roles, it's more women than it is men, or at least it's a higher percentage of women than it is men. And some companies, the proportions are way out of whack, like Facebook. And then in some companies, it's sort of a lesser proportion happening to a lesser degree, but still happening. I've spoken to many experts about this. One of the things is, historically those positions were held by women. That's sort of an excuse, but those kinds of things send out signals to where people are and what happens to the different groups. Admin support definitely has, a higher percentage of women. And when you look at the data differently for Black and Latino workers, if you look at the Black population in a particular company, you would see that many of them end up being in admin support. So they're probably getting in through the door via entry-level positions, and fewer of them are getting into those companies as professionals, as managers, or as executives. I think this data speaks to key things about how companies look like internally and how the compositions look like. And the second thing it speaks to is, what are the pathways for people who get into those entry-level positions, and do they have pathways to move up, and do those pathways exist? And if companies should be creating those pathways. And we definitely know from Angelica's example that she didn't have that option, that she was told. Angelica Coleman, who worked at Dropbox, she was definitely told that, if you want to be an admin, anything other than an admin, you would have to go somewhere else. And so she did go somewhere else. And I think the interesting thing about these examples of Shania and Angelica is that they were able to be successful, but they had to leave companies to do so, which raises the question of why didn't these companies, in whatever way or form, whether it's having a bureaucratic process that is sensitive to how it's keeping out certain groups, or being encouraging and supportive when employees ask to be promoted, or when employees prove that they can do other roles and move out of the admin support roles that they're a part of, then companies haven't really been listening to that. And that's definitely true of Dropbox, that when Angelica wanted to move up, and she has a verbal offer, according to her, she had a verbal offer from the head of design then, who said, you can come to our team and you can work as a user experience researcher. And the head of admin and other people in the company didn't allow her to make that move. And eventually she did move up. I mean, she went to Zendesk, and then she went to Lesbian Sutek, and she's been doing non-admin roles since then. So clearly she could have probably done that role at Dropbox, or should have been given that opportunity, but wasn't. The interesting thing is, do these people have pathways to move up? Because there are so many of them and more groups, in those jobs. And the other key part of this is, when this is what the composition of the workforce looks like, does that mean that there are signals and implicit and explicit messages being given out to groups of people and employees? Are we saying that if you belong to a particular group, then I think a researcher I spoke to put it very eloquently, that women of color and people of color, they have to constantly keep thinking about whether it's just that I don't see people like me up there because, they just haven't found anybody, or is it because that's not a job for me? Like, there's no pathway to get there. And that's the signal, or the key piece of implicit, explicit signals that we're talking about.
Right. And I think for people listening who may not understand the way, when you say pathways for people, the way it often works with inside these companies is that these companies often set up these superficial barriers for people by their title or by these job levels, right? So a person who's working as an admin may, I'm just making up a number, may be at a level 30 or something. I don't know what the levels are. And to move outside of the admin working role, you'd have to be at a different level, like a level 40, for instance, to become a user experience engineer or a product manager. And, someone has to actually grant you that level, that new level, from moving from a level 30 to a level 40 to get the new position. And, there's lots of bureaucratic steps in between that. And, often your skills have little to do with that.
Mm-hmm. I think, and what I've heard from reporting is that there's an extreme emphasis on engineering skills, but there was so much emphasis on engineering and engineering skills that all her experience of doing product management didn't amount to her being able to make the leap.
So you also interviewed someone, Charlotte Allegria, and I think she works on diversity in tech companies. She said something really interesting about how they choose to move people into positions, in managerial positions like product management positions, and that often women of color were not offered the same opportunities as white women or white men to moving into managerial roles. What did you learn about that from her?
I think for me, the interesting thing about Charla's findings, and when I got to speak to her, was I was hearing these stories from women of color, from Shania, from Angelica, from several other people. But for me, Charla's expertise, she'd interviewed 45 people, not all of them women of color, but, different men and women, white women, women of color. She'd interviewed 45 people in depth and did these extensive interviews with them, and learned, that for women of color, they were always in positions that they had exactly the skills and credentials for, according to her. And for white women, on the other hand, it was that their communication skills and their ability to communicate between technical and management skills were always appreciated. And they were always given these promotions to be managers, to be project managers, product managers. even if they necessarily didn't have the specialized skills for it. And if women of color wanted those roles to be managers, they would have to either go get an MBA or they would have to look for a separate mentor in another company. But it wasn't very easy for them to move from the roles that they were in into other roles. But that mobility was easier for white women. She said this with a caveat. She said that even for white women, and we know this from the data, that it's not that white women that are they're doing spectacularly well. There's still lower percentages of women in general, and true for white women too, except that at least these women had an opportunity to move out of engineering teams if they want to, because those teams tend to be deadline driven, sometimes hostile towards women, or that's what Charla found. And it was easier for white women to get out of those roles and move into managerial roles. They had that option. Women of color didn't have that option, and they would probably be more likely to leave tech. And those findings are all, tying in together with my data, with Charla's analysis, and with other reports that have come out about leaving tech and minorities leaving tech.
Right. So, which probably leads us to the attrition question, which we don't really have data on, right? So, it sounds like what you're saying, or what she was saying rather, was that when Black women were in these positions, their skills would match exactly for what was needed for that position, but they weren't given stretch goals, reach goals, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't offered these opportunities for using their communication skills to translate into managerial positions. They weren't being told that, hey, you're really good at your job, your technical stuff, but you also have these communication skills, which I think can be really useful or key in being a product manager, where you can translate between teams, between global teams, between different kinds of teams. So be that missing link. They weren't offered those jobs, but white women were.
So, what were some of the reasons that companies gave for their lack of diversity?
Many things. One of the things that I highlight in the report is the pipeline. Facebook in 2016, their global diversity officer blamed the pipeline. She said there aren't enough qualified candidates, or and she was Facebook's having a hard time finding qualified candidates. And so other companies have also said that the pipeline's a problem. The pipeline is a problem in the sense that you do have more Asian and white engineers coming out of the system, but the key difference is, there's a gap between the Black and the Latino engineers coming out of the system with computer science degrees and their representation in tech, not just in Facebook, of course, but like in Silicon Valley. So, when you look at those aggregate numbers, you see that the numbers don't match up, and then there's a difference or there's a gap. So what's going on in that gap is the question we raise, and other media outlets have raised as well. It's not that there's no pipeline problem. Women and minorities are getting fewer women and fewer minorities are getting CS degrees as compared to their white or Asian peers. But even when you look at the percentage of people getting the degrees and the percentage of people getting jobs, there's a drop off for these groups. And so that's the thing about the pipeline. It's not that they're wrong when they say the pipeline doesn't have as many, but they're wrong when they use that as an excuse, because, you're still not doing enough to recruit the numbers that you could be getting out of the pipeline, or they could utilize the pipeline much better is the point. The second thing I've heard over and over again with data transparency, that the EEO ones sort of don't reflect how they think of their workforce, that it has outdated job categories, or that it doesn't have data on age and disability and sexual orientation. And really the answer to that is, why don't you publish more of this and more of that? And then many companies are doing that, including NetApp, which said that and which opposed a shareholder resolution to release that EEO1 data, but then eventually ended up releasing that EEO1 data anyway and said, take a look at this. I mean, we have all this other information which we think is a better reflection of our workforce, but here's the EEO1 anyway. And what that does is that it helps us compare companies against each other.
Right. The pipeline also doesn't explain what happens when you have people of color already within the company, right? The fact that you have fewer at the executive levels and more at the kind of support admin levels, right? It doesn't explain that. And it doesn't explain the attrition numbers, for instance, that were just released by Google.
Yeah, I think the pipeline argument is more for professionals and skilled professionals. I think when we think about pathways, we're thinking about what can people in those positions do, and how companies can be conscious about people in support positions to help them up their skills, to help them get those skills they may need to move into professional and managerial roles and generally move up. But the pipeline problem is usually coming for not the support jobs, but for the professional jobs and for the engineering jobs, and then higher up after that. And the other thing about the pipeline is there have been reports that have said that the number of Black and Latino workers in technical positions outside of tech, like universities need people in tech positions, right? Banks need people in tech positions. And when you look at those numbers, there's a disparity there as well. The minority numbers or the percentages in tech versus the minority and percentages outside of tech in companies like universities and banks, there's a difference there as well. The minorities in tech are fewer, the percentages are fewer than what's happening for tech jobs in other sectors like universities and banks. So even in that sense, that it seems like there's more of a pipeline that's available than the representation in companies.
I see. So one of the solutions that's often offered is that, from people of color and for women to start their own companies, right?
Minorities and women are trying to start companies, very much so. And maybe they would recruit more people like them and continue with the network effect. But they don't have VC funding. The VC funding, Black women, the last I read, and I haven't deeply reported on this, but I've done some reporting, it was 0.2%. And I think women get like 2% of all the funding. Again, I'm quoting from Forbes and Wired and other news organizations that have reported on this issue. You can see that there's disparity in who gets funded. So if these people don't get funding or these groups don't get funding, then how are they supposed to be starting their own companies? So that's a key part of why that doesn't happen, or where the barriers happen when minority groups try to start their own companies.
Right. So where do we go from here? How do we take this data and apply it and make good use of it?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's more to be done with this data. We've looked at some trends, but there's a lot more that can happen here. I think the next step is, if more companies release EEO1s, and some of them are on the verge of doing so, is see where they rank. It's a great resource for anyone who wants to see where their company is on the spectrum. And I think that's also a key piece of information required for tech employees, to know if they would be safe in companies, if that's the best choice and fit for them. Because if the company values diversity, minorities who join those companies might enjoy their experience there or might feel better there. So I think the next step really is about how many companies come forward, and if we can identify the leaders who actually have good numbers and identify the stragglers who don't look so good, if where each company falls on the spectrum.
The interesting thing about that is just that I don't really understand at this juncture the need for the secrecy, right? I mean, they aren't proud of these numbers, but it isn't a secret that they don't have great diversity numbers anyhow. I mean, I was just talking to a friend about that I was going to do a podcast on diversity in Silicon Valley, and they said there's diversity in Silicon Valley. I mean, they only have something to gain by being more transparent, right?
I mean, I think the nuanced answer to that is there have been cases in the past when companies have been transparent and they've criticized for their poor numbers. So there could be that fear of pushback. But on the other hand, companies that have even the companies that have been criticized in the long term, in the short term, media companies might criticize. But in the long term, I think there's value in being transparent, especially if you care to move the needle on diversity, even if you have poor numbers. If those numbers have improved over time, that's a key thing to keep track of and think about. And I think the other interesting thing is that in the long term, it's a cumulative effect. You probably had bad numbers one year, you've been working towards improving your diversity. It's not just about numbers too. It's like numbers are an indicator, but they're not everything. So you've been working towards helping your employees belong or creating an inclusive culture. And in the long term, I think those short-term pushbacks probably don't matter, but companies might be afraid of that.
Well, I will definitely follow your continued work on this, and I hope to see the numbers improve. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all your questions.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a supporter of the Electorette. Visit us at electorette.com and click on the donation link at the top of the page. The Electorette is now available on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and Stitcher. Please consider subscribing using your favorite podcast platform. Also, please like us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/Electorette. And until next time, keep up the good fight.